Hey there, midnight dwellers and history fiends. Here's a riddle for you. What costs more, being rich or being poor? If you said being rich, congratulations, you've never been poor. If you said being poor, welcome to the longest-running scam in human history. Tonight, I'm going to prove that being broke is the most expensive lifestyle choice you never chose. Before we dive into the abyss tonight, smash that like button if you're ready to have your soul crushed by the truth. Subscribe if you want more nightmares disguised as education. And comment below. Tell me what you'd do if you found yourself trapped in poverty through the ages with no way out. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll realize your answer might be darker than you think. Tonight, we're talking about the most terrifying monster that ever stalked humanity. Not vampires, not demons, but poverty itself. The kind that doesn't just kill you. It devours your future, your children's futures, and haunts your family for generations. This little piece of paper, it's either going to multiply or disappear, depending on how much money you already have. And for the past 2,000 years, humanity has been running the same brutal math. The less you have, the more everything costs. I'm your guide through time's greatest economic tragedy, a story where the punchline is always poverty, and the house always wins. Buckle up, because we're about to discover how civilization turned desperation into a business model. Rome, where poverty was performance, 800 BCE, 476 CE. Ancient Rome concentrated the majority of land in the hands of a small class of wealthy people, leaving the rest of the population with little land. But here's the twist, being landless in Rome wasn't just about farming. It was about survival itself. His name is Marcus Brocius, and he lived in a Roman insulate, a 6-story apartment building that's basically a vertical slum. The higher you live, the cheaper the rent, which means he is on the 6th floor where the building sways in the wind and collapses twice a year. He pays 30% more per square foot than rich folks in their villas because poor people don't have options. Plus, he has to buy water from the guy downstairs who has a key to the public fountain. That's right, he pays subscription fee for hydration. Some people sold themselves into contractual slavery to escape poverty. But here's the beautiful part, once you're in debt slavery, you work to pay off the debt. But the interest keeps growing faster than you can work. It's the first subscription service you can't cancel. Rome perfected the art of making poverty profitable. Can't afford food? Sell yourself. Can't work off the debt? That's a you problem. It's victim blaming with imperial efficiency. Byzantine Empire, Christian poverty with interest rates 330-1453 CE. Behold, we are Christians now. We care for the poor. Terms and conditions apply. Interest rates may vary. The Byzantine economy was among the most robust economies in the Mediterranean, but robust for whom? The Byzantines created history's first Christian welfare system with a business model. Welcome to the Monastery of Saint Expensive. We help the poor through our patented Poverty Plus program. For salvation, simply donate everything you own. Can't afford salvation? Try our layaway plan. Work for us until you can afford to be saved. I'm Constantinos, the constantly broke. I'm a farmer, but I don't own land. I rent it from the monastery, buy seeds on credit from the monastery, sell my grain to the monastery, and when I can't pay the monastery, I work for the monastery. It's vertical integration, medieval style. The Byzantines convinced people that being poor was spiritually beneficial while making sure it was economically ruinous. Blessed are the poor, they said, while charging them extra for everything. It's gaslighting with gospel backing. Welcome to Tenochtitlan, where we've turned poverty into performance art. Can't pay your debts? Congratulations, you're now a product. People were enslaved as a form of punishment after capturing in war or voluntarily to pay off debts. Individuals who fell into debt could be sold into slavery as a means of repayment. This form of slavery, known as debt slavery, was prevalent in Aztec society. He is Itzel the financially ruined. He borrowed cacao beans to buy corn during the drought. Now he owes more cacao beans than exist in the entire empire, so he sells his children and then himself to pay off a loan that mathematically cannot be repaid. The Aztecs invented the payday loan 500 years before payday loans. Nothing personal, Itzel. You sign the codex. Your children will work our fields until they pay off your debt, plus interest, plus the cost of housing them, plus feeding them, plus the fee for calculating what they owe. Don't worry, they'll only be indebted for about forever. The Aztecs discovered something brilliant. You can sell people their own desperation. Debt slavery wasn't punishment, it was customer service. Can't afford to live? We'll help you afford to be owned. The Dark Ages plague, pray, and pay 5001000 CE. Welcome to the Dark Ages, where being poor isn't just expensive, it's literally dark. We can't afford candles. The medieval period perfected poverty as a lifestyle brand. You weren't just poor, you were part of God's plan. And God's plan had an extensive fee structure. The feudal subscription model, the emperor's speech. Greetings, peasants. I'm Lord Exploitus the Hereditary. You live on my land, work my fields, and pay me rent for the privilege of existing. Can't afford rent? Perfect. Work off the debt. Still can't pay? Your children can inherit the debt. It's a family plan. I'm Willem the eternally indebted. I rent land to grow food I can't afford to eat. To pay rent I can't afford to pay. To a lord who owns me because his great-great-grandfather killed my great-great-grandfather. But hey, at least it's sustainable, sustainably horrible. Willem, my child, your poverty is God's test. But for just 10% of nothing, the church will pray for your soul. Can't afford 10% of nothing? Try our layaway salvation plan. Work for the church until you can afford to be blessed. Medieval Europe turned poverty into a spiritual experience with economic consequences. Being poor wasn't just expensive, it was eternal. They charged you for this life and the next one. The Black Death, when dying became big business, 1347 to 1351. Welcome to 1348, where death is the only growth industry, and being poor means you can't even afford to die properly. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe, but the other 2/3 discovered that catastrophe was profitable if you had money to begin with. Plague insurance. Get your plague insurance here. Only cost you your cow. Can't afford plague insurance? Try our premium dying service. Will bury you in the nice plague pit for just your daughter's dowry. She is Margot the moderately deceased. Can't afford medicine, which is mostly bloodletting anyway, so she is treating the plague with hope and expired turnips. Her family can't afford a proper burial, so she is going in the community grave with Farmer Joe and his pig. At least in death we're finally equal. The wage freeze innovation King Edward III, pompously addressing his subjects. My loyal subjects, I see that massive death has created a labor shortage, and you're asking for higher wages to feed your surviving families. Clearly, this is unpatriotic. I hereby freeze all wages at pre-plague levels. Economics. Edward III Ordinance of Laborers, 1349, was history's first essential workers don't deserve more pay policy. 30% of your coworkers are dead, but asking for a raise makes you a criminal. It's disaster capitalism with a crown. Henry VIII, chest puffed out magnificently. I am Henry VIII, and I need money for wives, wars, and codpieces. Solution: let's privatize charity. Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 to 1541, destroying Europe's social safety net to fund his personal soap opera. It's like if someone bought all the homeless shelters and turned them into casinos. The great charity theft becomes desperate former monk. I was Brother Benedict the Charitable. Yesterday, I ran a monastery feeding 300 poor families daily. Today, Henry seized our land, sold our food stores, and melted down our silverware. Now those 300 families are my problem, except I'm homeless too. Tudor bureaucrat adjusting spectacles smugly. Fear not. We've replaced religious charity with secular innovation. The licensed begging program. Simply prove you're deserving poor, not undeserving poor. Obtain proper documentation. Stay in your designated parish and beg professionally. The licensing of misery where licensed beggar holds imaginary permit. He is Thomas the officially pathetic. This paper certifies that he is legally miserable and permitted to ask for scraps on Tuesdays and Thursdays, between sunrise and sunset, in parishes 3 through 7, provided he don't frighten livestock or make eye contact with nobility. The Tudors invented means testing misery. You couldn't just be poor, you had to be the right kind of poor in the right place with the right paperwork. It's bureaucratic torture with a Renaissance flair. Welcome to London, 1840. The air tastes like coal dust and desperation. And I'm about to show you why being poor wasn't just hard. It was literally a death sentence that came with interest. The first thing you need to understand about being poor in the 1800s is this: everything cost more when you had nothing. I'm talking about a system so twisted, so fundamentally broken, that it would make modern payday loans look like charity work. You're standing outside Murphy's Bakery on Whitechapel Road. It's 4 a.m., and the fog is so thick you can barely see your own hands. The scent of fresh bread cuts through the stench of sewage and coal smoke like a knife through your empty stomach. You've got 3 pence in your pocket, that's it. That's all that stands between your family and starvation. But here's the kicker, that loaf of bread costs 4 pence if you buy it individually. But if you could afford to buy a dozen loaves, 2.5 pence each. The rich got discounts for having money. The poor paid premiums for being broke. Imagine if a single pack of ramen cost $8, but a case of 24 cost $3 each. Same bread, same ingredients, but your poverty literally made it impossible to access the cheaper option. Now, I started seeing things around this time in my research. Call it exhaustion, call it the weight of these stories, but I swear the bread in that bakery window. It started looking back at me. The crust cracked like smiles, revealing centers that bled red when hungry children pressed their faces against the glass. Mrs. Henderson, a widow with 4 children, would send her youngest, little Tommy, maybe 7 years old, to beg for day-old bread scraps. The bakers would sometimes take pity, but mostly they'd shoo him away like a rat. Tommy's stomach had long since stopped growling. It had moved on to this hollow, echoing silence that seemed to fill the entire alley. One night, Tommy never came home. They found him in the morning, curled up against the bakery door like he was still waiting. The doctor said malnutrition, But Mrs. Henderson swore she could see bite marks on his tiny body, like the bread had finally gotten its revenge. The thing about starvation is that it doesn't just kill you. It drives you mad first. Mrs. Henderson started talking to Tommy's ghost, setting out portions of air for dinner. The neighbors whispered that she'd finally snapped, but I think she saw what I'm starting to see now. The phantom children of poverty, the ones who haunt every decision you can't afford to make. See, when you're poor, every choice becomes a calculation of survival. Buy bread today and go without coal tomorrow. Send your child to work or watch them starve at home. Pay rent and eat nothing but scraps, or sleep in the streets with a full belly. Each decision creates a ghost, the life you could have lived if you'd chosen differently. And these ghosts, they pile up. They whisper in the walls. They follow families for generations. The wealthy merchants would walk past these starving families and genuinely believe that poverty was a moral failing. If they just worked harder, they'd say, counting coins earned from selling overpriced necessities to the desperate. They couldn't see what I'm starting to see, that every transaction was feeding something darker. Today we call it food deserts and poverty taxes. Same game, different century. Poor neighborhoods get charged more for groceries, banking, insurance, everything. The system hasn't changed. It's just learned to wear a suit. As I write this, I can hear Mrs. Henderson calling for Tommy in the next room. But that's impossible. I'm alone in my study, 180 years later. The voices of the poor don't rest easy. They echo through time, demanding to be heard. If you thought the bread was expensive, wait until you heard about housing. In 1840s London, a single room in a cellar, and I mean a room where sewage seeped through the walls and rats were your only roommates, cost about 6 shillings a week. That doesn't sound like much until you realize the average factory worker made about 15 shillings a week if they were lucky enough to work full-time. 40% of your income for a room that was literally killing you. Imagine paying $2,400 a month for a basement apartment with no windows, no heat, and a ceiling so low you couldn't stand up straight. Oh, and the neighbors upstairs use your room as their bathroom. Welcome to poverty housing. But here's where it gets truly demonic. The poorer you were, the more you paid per night. If you couldn't afford to pay weekly rent in advance, you'd have to pay nightly at a higher rate. If you couldn't afford that, you'd end up in the casual wards. Basically prison cells where they'd work you to death during the day and charge you for the privilege of not freezing at night. Multiple families often lived in a single room without proper sanitation or ventilation. I'm talking about 12 people in a space the size of a modern walk-in closet. Children sleeping standing up because there wasn't room to lie down. Adults taking shifts sleeping because the floor space had to be rationed. Let me tell you about the Whitmore family. 7 people crammed into a cellar room that flooded every time it rained. The father, William, worked 16-hour days in a match factory, breathing phosphorus fumes that would eventually eat away his jaw. The mother, Sarah, took in piecework sewing, hunched over fabric by candlelight until her vision failed. Their landlord, Mr. Ashworth, was what you'd call a poverty vampire. He owned 50 of these cellar rooms and made more money per square foot than the luxury hotels did uptown. He'd show up every week like clockwork, dressed in black from head to toe, collecting his rents with the precision of death itself. Sarah Whitmore started seeing things in the walls. She'd whisper to me later, yes, she talks to me now, they all do, that the mold patterns looked like faces. Faces of all the people who died in that room before them. These conditions were ideal for the spread of bacteria and infectious diseases, and Sarah wasn't wrong about the faces. That room had claimed 14 lives in 5 years. The walls themselves seemed to sweat with desperation. Every night you could hear scratching, not just rats but something deeper. The sound of fingernails clawing at stone, of people buried alive in their own poverty, trying to dig their way out. The most terrifying part? The rent always went up. If you improved the room, patched a hole, fixed a broken board, Ashworth would raise the rent. If you complained about conditions, he'd raise the rent. If you missed a payment by even a day, he'd add interest that compounded faster than mold spread on bread. When families couldn't pay, the evictions were theatrical, almost ceremonial. Ashworth would arrive with 2 men in black coats who moved with the silence of undertakers. They'd throw everything into the street: furniture, clothes, children's toys, sick relatives. The evicted families would huddle in doorways, watching their possessions get rained on, stolen, or burned for fuel by other desperate souls. Children would press their faces against the windows of their former homes, watching new families move in, knowing they'd face the same fate eventually. I've started seeing these evicted families in my peripheral vision. They're always there, just outside my window, waiting with their soggy bundles and hollow eyes. The ghosts of displacement never leave the places they once called home. Today's rent crisis follows the same playbook: security deposits you can't afford, application fees that multiply your costs, credit checks that exclude the poor from better options. Poverty is still the most expensive thing you can't afford to buy your way out of. When rent became impossible, families faced the workhouse. Bare-bones facilities designed to make poverty seem even less attractive. These weren't shelters. They were punishment centers. Families were separated, given uniforms that marked them as failures, and worked until their bodies gave out. The Whitmore children ended up separated across 3 different workhouses. They never saw each other again. Sarah died of cholera in a workhouse infirmary, and William's phosphorus-rotted jaw finally claimed him in a workhouse yard, still trying to work despite barely being able to speak. Their ghosts haunt every rental listing I see now. Sarah whispers rent prices that families can't afford. William points out hidden fees with his skeletal finger, and their children. Their children just stand in empty rooms, waiting for parents who will never come home. Let me paint you a picture of hell, and then tell you that people called it employment opportunity. The Blackburn Cotton Mill, 1842. 5 a.m., and the air is already thick with cotton dust that turns your lungs into sandpaper. The machines, massive, steam-powered beasts with more moving parts than a clockwork demon, are hungry, and they're about to be fed a breakfast of children. In 1800, there were 20,000 apprentices working in cotton mills. The apprentices were particularly vulnerable to maltreatment, industrial accidents, and ill health from overwork and contagious diseases. Here's the twisted economics. Children were cheaper than adults, and their small fingers could reach places full-grown hands couldn't. A 10-year-old could crawl under moving machinery to oil gears while the mill was still running. If they were fast enough, they'd keep their fingers. If not, well, the factory had plenty more children waiting outside. Little Mary Patterson, age 9, worked 14 hours a day scavenging, crawling under the massive looms to collect cotton waste while the machines thundered above her head. Her wage, 3 shillings a week. That's about what a wealthy family spent on a single bottle of wine. The machines had personalities, the workers swore to it. The big loom in Section C was called the Widowmaker. It had claimed 6 children in 2 years, always in the same way. Their hair would get caught in the spinning wheels, and by the time someone could shut down the machine, I won't describe what was left. I can't. But Mary would whisper to the other children that she could hear the Widowmaker calling their names during the night shifts. Picture Dante's Inferno, but with better profit margins. A first circle, the preparation room children as young as 6 sorting cotton, breathing in fibers that would destroy their lungs by age 20. A second circle, the spinning floor teenagers operating machines designed for adults, working with exposed gears that could crush bones in seconds. A third circle, the weaving hell. The noise was so loud that workers communicated entirely in hand signals. Many went deaf by their teens. Mr. Harrison Blackburn calculated that a child who died after 2 years of work had still generated enough profit to justify the investment in their training. He kept ledgers, actual books where he recorded child's name, age when hired, productivity rate, date of injury/death, net profit generated. Imagine Amazon keeping spreadsheets of how much money they made from workers before those workers had nervous breakdowns. Oh wait, Mary Patterson didn't die in the machines. She was too quick, too careful. But the machines killed her anyway. The cotton dust destroyed her lungs slowly, methodically. By 14, she was coughing up blood. By 16, she couldn't climb stairs without stopping to gasp. By 18, she was dead. But here's what haunts me most. Mary kept working until the day she died. She couldn't afford to stop. The choice was work or starve, and at least work offered the illusion of purpose. I can hear the machines running in my study now. The rhythmic pounding, the hiss of steam, the whispers of small voices calling for help. The factory never really shuts down, it just moves, following the poor wherever they go. Factory owners had recruiters who would travel to rural areas during famines, promising families that their children would be apprenticed in good trades. They'd offer to feed and house the children, taking that burden off struggling families. What they didn't mention, the children were essentially sold into slavery, locked in factory dormitories at night, worked to exhaustion during the day, and punished brutally for any sign of resistance. Today we call it human trafficking when it happens in other countries and unpaid internships when it happens here. The exploitation of desperation never goes out of style. The most chilling detail? Many factories required children to sing hymns while they worked. All things bright and beautiful. Jesus loves the little children. Songs about God's love echoing through halls where children were literally being fed to machines. The irony wasn't lost on the workers. They started making up their own verses. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the factory kills them all. As I write this, I can hear children singing in the distance. The same hymns, but the words are wrong now. They're singing about machines with teeth, about owners who feast on small bones, about the factory that never sleeps and never stops being hungry. By 1850, the mortality rate for children younger than 5 years was a staggering 52%. In factory districts, it was even higher. Parents were burying every other child, and the survivors were being worked to death before they reached adulthood. The machines weren't just manufacturing textiles, they were manufacturing ghosts. And those ghosts are still running the assembly lines in my nightmares. tiny fingers reaching for gears that will never stop turning. If you got sick while poor in the 1800s, you had three options: suffer in silence, die quickly, or let some quack doctor kill you slowly while emptying your pockets. Guess which one most people chose? A doctor's visit cost about 10 shillings, 2/3 of a worker's weekly wage. That's like paying $2,000 for a basic checkup today. So when little Timothy Hartwell came down with what we'd now recognize as pneumonia, his family faced an impossible choice: pay the doctor and starve for 2 weeks, or hope the boy's lungs were stronger than the disease. They chose hope. Timothy lasted 4 days. But here's where poverty's cruelest joke comes in. Dying was expensive too. A proper burial cost more than most families made in a month. So Timothy ended up in what they called a pauper's grave, a pit where they'd stack bodies like cordwood until it was full, then throw some dirt on top. Since real doctors were for the wealthy, the poor had to settle for traveling medicine shows and street corner physicians with bottles full of colored water and false hope. Dr. Malachi Grimm, yes, that was his real name. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. Rolled into Whitechapel every month with a wagon full of miracle cures. His universal remedy was supposed to cure everything from tuberculosis to broken hearts. The main ingredient: alcohol, opium, and mercury. It would make you feel amazing right up until it killed you. Imagine if Facebook ads for sketchy supplements were your only healthcare option, except these supplements were literally poisonous. Mrs. Eleanor Catchpole spent her last 5 shillings on Dr. Grimm's consumption cure for her husband's tuberculosis. The bottle contained mercury, lead paint, and grain alcohol. It didn't cure the tuberculosis, but it did give him mercury poisoning on top of everything else. I can still hear Mrs. Catchpole's voice in my study at night. She's reading the label on that bottle over and over. Guaranteed to restore health and vigor or your money back. But Dr. Grimm was long gone by the time her husband started convulsing. If you couldn't afford medicine or doctors, your final option was the workhouse infirmary, and calling it medical care was like calling drowning a swimming lesson. Conditions in the casual wards were worse than in the regular housing. The medical ward was where they put people to die quietly. No medicine, no treatment, just a place to stack the sick until they stopped breathing. Here's something that will chill your blood. Poor people's bodies weren't even safe after death. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy lessons, but they couldn't legally buy them. So they hired resurrection men, grave robbers who would dig up fresh corpses and sell them to doctors. The wealthy could afford iron coffins and guarded cemeteries. The poor got shallow graves that were emptied before the dirt had settled. Families would take turns watching graves for the first week after burial, because if the body snatchers got your loved one, they'd end up on a dissection table being carved up for educational purposes. Rapid industrialization and urbanization had created many poor, filthy, and foul-smelling city neighborhoods that tended to be the focal points of disease and epidemics. When cholera swept through London in 1832, 1848, and 1854, it was like death himself had set up shop in the slums. The disease killed you in the most horrifying way possible. Violent vomiting, explosive diarrhea, and dehydration so severe your skin turned blue. You could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. Only 5 of the 530 inmates had contracted cholera, because nobody from the workhouse drank the pump water, as the building had its own well. The poor drank from public pumps that were literally connected to sewage systems. The wealthy had private wells. Your access to clean water depended on your bank account. I've started seeing cholera victims in my research. They appear suddenly, blue-faced and retching, pointing at water glasses with skeletal fingers. The message is clear. Even something as basic as water becomes poisoned when you're too poor to afford alternatives. Toothaches were agony, and dental care was luxury. Poor people would try to extract their own teeth with pliers, or pay a blacksmith to do it with the same tools he used on horses. Infection was common. Death from sepsis was frequent. But here's the kicker: sugar was cheap. It was one of the few sweet pleasures the poor could afford. So their teeth rotted while they couldn't afford to fix them. Another perfect poverty trap. When you can't afford medicine, you get creative. Drinking mercury for syphilis, it didn't work, but it did give you mercury poisoning. Rubbing tobacco on wounds, nicotine is actually antimicrobial, so this sometimes worked. Using moldy bread as antibiotics, penicillin exists in some molds, so occasionally this was accidentally effective. Drinking urine for kidney problems. This never worked and was disgusting. Sometimes, through sheer luck, poverty medicine actually worked. A street vendor's herbal tea might contain willow bark, natural aspirin. A folk remedy might have actual medicinal properties. But it was pure chance, Russian roulette with bottles instead of bullets. The ghosts of all these failed treatments surround me now. Bottles with no labels, promises with no substance, hope with no foundation. They rattle in my cabinets, whisper false cures in my ears, and remind me that desperation makes people believe in miracles that never come. Today, we have people rationing insulin, avoiding emergency rooms because of debt, and buying medicine from overseas because they can't afford American prices. The faces change, the century changes, but the cruelty remains the same. Your health is only as good as your wealth. As I finish this section, I can hear coughing from every room in my house. It's the sound of 1,000 poor lungs, struggling for air they'll never get, in a system that profits from their suffering. The medicine show never ended, it just learned to wear a lab coat. Here's where the horror gets truly existential. Every poor child who couldn't afford school became a ghost of themselves. A phantom twin representing the life they could have lived if society had valued their potential over their parents' bank account. In 1840s England, basic literacy school cost about 2 pence per week per child. Doesn't sound like much, right? But remember, we're talking about families who couldn't afford bread. For a working-class family with 4 children, sending them all to school would cost 8 pence weekly, more than half a day's wages. So families had to choose. Which child gets the chance? Usually it was the eldest boy if they could afford to send any at all. The rest, the daughters, the younger sons, the sickly ones, became intellectual ghosts before they'd even lived. Let me tell you about Jenny Mullins, age 12, who could do complex arithmetic in her head faster than educated adults could do it on paper. She'd figured out mathematical principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for another decade. But she worked in a matchstick factory, breathing phosphorus fumes instead of attending university. I've seen her ghost in my study. Still 12 years old, still brilliant, still holding a bundle of matchsticks while equations float around her head like halos. She's trying to solve problems that the world will never let her attempt. Every poor child created a shadow self, a ghost twin who got to attend school, learn to read, develop their natural talents, and contribute to human knowledge. These phantom children crowd around me as I write, pointing at books they'll never read, whispering discoveries they'll never make. Imagine if college cost $200,000 per year, with no financial aid, no scholarships, and no payment plans. Only the wealthy could afford to develop their minds, while brilliant poor kids worked in warehouses their entire lives. Some factory owners set up schools for their child workers, an hour of basic reading lessons in exchange for 14 hours of labor. These weren't education. They were psychological manipulation designed to make child labor seem philanthropic. The lessons were strictly controlled. Basic reading, enough to read safety warnings. Simple arithmetic, enough to count your meager wages. And moral instruction, enough to accept your place at the bottom of society. Religious organizations offered free Sunday schools for poor children, which sounds charitable until you realize what they actually taught. God loves the poor, so stop complaining. The meek shall inherit the earth after they're dead. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. So actually you're lucky to be suffering. These weren't schools, they were indoctrination centers designed to make poverty feel like virtue. Thomas Hartwell, remember Timothy's little brother who survived, was obsessed with books. He'd press his face against library windows, watching wealthy children browse shelves that might as well have been on the moon. Library membership required a deposit equal to 2 months' wages, deliberately designed to exclude the working class. Thomas taught himself to read using newspaper scraps and advertising posters. By age 14, he was reading discarded medical journals and had taught himself basic anatomy. By 16, he could have been a doctor if society had invested in his mind instead of his muscles. Instead, he died at 19 in a factory accident, still clutching a tattered copy of Gray's Anatomy that he'd found in a trash pile. His ghost sits in my study now, reading medical texts with eyes that glow with unfulfilled potential. He whispers about the patients he could have saved, the discoveries he could have made, if only the world had seen his mind instead of just his poverty. If being poor made education difficult, being poor and female made it nearly impossible. Girls were expected to start working as soon as they could hold a needle or carry a tray. Education for girls was considered a waste of money since they'd just get married anyway. Mary Hartwell, Thomas's sister, could recite entire poems after hearing them once. She had a gift for language that could have made her a great writer or teacher. Instead, she worked in a laundry from age 8 until she died of lung disease at 22. Her phantom twin stands behind every woman who never got to use her mind, whispering the novels she never wrote, the students she never taught, the words the world never heard. The only education available to poor boys was apprenticeships, but these were often elaborate schemes to get free labor for 7 years in exchange for teaching trades that were already becoming obsolete. A boy would be apprenticed to learn blacksmithing just as factories were making hand-forged items irrelevant. By the time his 7 years were up, his valuable trade was worthless, and he'd lost the prime years of his life for skills no one needed. Occasionally, wealthy philanthropists would offer scholarships to deserving poor children. These were PR stunts more than genuine opportunities. Maybe 1 child per 1,000 would be selected, always with conditions that ensured they'd never threaten the established order. The selected children were displayed like circus performers. Look how generous we are! But they were also isolated from their communities and trained to reject their origins, becoming advertisements for a system that actually worked against their former peers. The cruelest aspect? Uneducated parents couldn't help their children learn, even if they wanted to. Illiterate mothers couldn't read bedtime stories. Enumerate fathers couldn't help with mathematics. Each generation of educational poverty ensured the next generation would be equally trapped. I see them all now. Generations of ghost families, parents reaching toward children they can't teach, children reaching toward futures they can't access. All of them trapped in an endless cycle of unfulfilled potential. Today, we have student loans that create decades of debt, schools funded by property taxes, ensuring poor areas get poor education, and extracurricular activities that cost more than many families earn. We've refined the system, but the core principle remains. Intellectual development is a luxury good. As I write this final section, my study has filled with phantom students. Children who never learned to read, teenagers who never learned to think critically, adults who never learned they were capable of greatness. They're all reaching toward books they'll never hold, toward knowledge they'll never access. Their whispers blend into a chorus that haunts every school budget cut, every education policy that favors the wealthy, every brilliant mind we've lost to the economics of artificial scarcity. The ghost children of missed opportunities don't rest. They can't. They're still trying to learn, still reaching toward the light of knowledge, even in death. And their lesson is clear. A society that doesn't educate its poor is a society that kills its own future. Debt in the 1800s wasn't just financial, it was supernatural. I'm convinced now that debt collectors were literally soul reapers, feeding on human desperation and growing stronger with each payment extracted from the starving. When William Ashworth, our slum landlord from Hour 2, started lending money, his interest rates would make modern loan sharks blush. He'd lend 5 shillings and expect 6 back by the end of the week. That's 20% weekly interest over 1,000% annually. Modern comparison. Imagine borrowing $100 and owing $110 after 7 days. Miss that payment? Now you owe $121. Miss another week? $133. Within a month, your $100 debt has become $200, and it keeps growing faster than you can ever hope to pay. But here's the demonic twist. Ashworth designed his loans to be impossible to repay. He would lend money only to people who were already desperate, knowing they'd miss payments, knowing the debt would compound, knowing they'd become financial slaves for life. Ashworth employed 3 men who moved through the slums like harbingers of doom. Silent Samuel never spoke, just held out his hand. His presence alone made children cry. Counting Pete obsessively tallied numbers, whispering calculations under his breath like incantations. Bones McGillicuddy, called Bones, because he was thin as death and twice as cold. They traveled together in a black cart drawn by a horse so underfed it looked skeletal. The sound of their wheels on cobblestones was like a funeral march, and everyone knew what it meant. Someone's luck had run out. When a family couldn't pay, the collectors didn't just take money, they took pieces of life. First visit, furniture, clothes, anything of value. Second visit, food, cookware, blankets. A third visit, children, sold into apprenticeships to pay the debt. Final visit, the debtor themselves, debtor's prison. I can hear their cart rolling through my neighborhood now, the wheels scraping against stone, the horses' labored breathing, the whispered calculations getting closer. Debt never dies, it just finds new victims. Sarah Whitmore, Remember her from the housing section? Borrowed 2 shillings to buy medicine for her sick baby. The baby died anyway. But the debt lived on, growing like a cancer. Week 1, owe 2 shillings for pence. Week 2, owe 2 shillings 8 pence. Week 3, owe 3 shillings. Month 1, owe 4 shillings. Month 6, owe 12 shillings. Year 1, owe 35 shillings. By the time Sarah died of cholera, she owed more than her husband made in 2 months. And the debt didn't die with her. It transferred to her surviving children like a generational curse. When you couldn't pay, they didn't just forgive the debt. They locked you up in Marshalsea or Fleet Prison, where you had to pay for your own imprisonment. That's right, you had to pay rent to be in jail for not being able to pay rent. Inside debtor's prison. Rent for your cell 2 shillings per week. Food if you wanted to eat 1 shilling per day. Bedding rental 6 pence per week. Permission to have visitors 3 pence per visit. Imagine being jailed for student loan debt, then being charged $500 per week to stay in jail, plus $200 per day for food. Oh, and your debt keeps growing while you're inside. Here's where it gets truly satanic. Families were separated by debt. Husbands went to debtor's prison while wives and children were left to starve or end up in workhouses. Children were sold into apprenticeships to pay off their parents' debts. Families were literally torn apart by mathematics. The Hartwell family was destroyed this way. Remember William from the factory section? His wife Margaret borrowed money to buy food while he was recovering from a factory accident. When the debt collectors came, they took William to debtor's prison. Their eldest son Thomas, sold to a ship captain as cabin boy. Their daughter Mary, apprenticed to a milliner. Margaret and the youngest children to the workhouse. None of them ever saw each other again. I see them now, the Hartwell family, reaching across the void of financial destruction, trying to touch hands that will never meet again. Their ghostly forms are connected by chains made of unpaid bills, compound interest calculations floating around them like cursed prayer books. When borrowing wasn't an option, families would pawn their possessions, trading their wedding rings for bread money, their Sunday clothes for rent. But pawnshops were another poverty trap. You'd pawn your winter coat in September when you needed food money, then freeze in December because you couldn't afford to buy it back. Moses Goldstein ran the largest pawnshop in Whitechapel. His shop was like a museum of broken dreams. Wedding dresses from marriages that didn't survive poverty, children's toys from families that couldn't afford Christmas, tools from craftsmen who'd lost their trades to mechanization. Moses kept meticulous records, but I swear his ledger book wrote itself. The numbers would change when no one was looking, always in the house's favor. Debts would grow overnight, payment records would disappear, and interest would compound in ways that defied mathematics. His ghost still tends that shop in my nightmares. He's counting coins that turn to dust in his hands, while the pawned items behind him whisper the names of their original owners. Here's a horror that'll make your blood run cold. Poor families would take out life insurance policies on their children because child mortality was so high, it was practically a guaranteed payout. But the premiums were designed to drain families dry. You'd pay more in premiums than you'd ever receive in benefits. Some families were driven to unspeakable choices. When little Mary Patterson, from the factory section, was dying of lung disease, her parents faced a terrible calculation. Pay for medicine that might save her, or let her die and collect the insurance money that could feed the rest of the family for months. Today's payday loans, medical debt, student loans, and credit card interest rates follow the same playbook. The poor pay more for everything. Higher interest rates, more fees, worse terms. Poverty is still the most expensive thing you can't afford. As I finish this section, I can hear the cartwheels getting closer. The debt collectors never stop working, they just change their uniforms. Now they wear suits and carry calculators instead of ledgers. But their mission remains the same: to harvest desperation and turn human suffering into compound interest. The most terrifying realization? These debts don't end with death. They follow families across generations, creating cycles of poverty that last for centuries. The ghosts of unpaid bills haunt bloodlines, ensuring that great-great-grandchildren will pay for debts incurred in the 1800s. I can see them all now, the endless parade of debt collectors throughout history. Their black carts replaced by black cars, their ledgers replaced by computers, but their purpose unchanged: to extract the maximum amount of suffering from the minimum amount of hope. Death was supposed to be the great equalizer. But even in death, poverty found a way to extract one final payment. The graveyards of the 1800s weren't resting places. They were sorting facilities where society's final judgment was rendered in dirt and stone. A proper funeral in 1840s London cost about £2, more than most working families earned in a month. This included the wooden coffin, the cheapest available; the burial plot, the smallest size; the gravestone, a simple wooden marker; transportation to the cemetery. Imagine if a basic funeral cost $15,000 with no payment plans, no insurance, and no government assistance. Most families would have to choose between burying their loved ones with dignity or eating for the next 6 months. When families couldn't afford individual burials, bodies went to the pauper's pit, a mass grave where they'd stack corpses like cordwood until the hole was full. No coffins, no markers, no dignity. Just lime powder to speed decomposition and dirt to hide the shame. The Whitmore children, remember them from the housing section? All ended up in the same pauper's pit in different years. Their parents never knew where their children were buried. There were no records, no markers, no way to visit or mourn properly. I've been to that pit. It's still there, unmarked, beneath a parking lot in modern London. But I can hear them, hundreds of voices calling out names that were never recorded, lives that were never acknowledged. Here's where poverty became truly monstrous. Medical schools needed fresh corpses for anatomy lessons, but they couldn't legally purchase them. So they hired resurrection men, professional grave robbers who would dig up recently buried paupers and sell their bodies to doctors. The wealthy could afford iron coffins, private cemeteries with guards, and family vaults that were impossible to rob. The poor got shallow graves that were emptied before the mourners had walked home. Digger Dan Sullivan ran the most successful body-snatching operation in London. His crew would watch pauper funerals, noting which graves had fresh dirt and no guards. They'd return within 48 hours before the body started decomposing, and extract the corpse with surgical precision. Dan kept business ledgers like any merchant. A fresh adult corpse, 8 shillings. Child's body, 4 shillings. A body parts for specific medical lessons priced by the piece. Dan's ghost still patrols cemeteries in my nightmares, carrying a lantern that casts no light and a shovel that digs graves instead of filling them. He's still looking for customers, still harvesting the poor for profit. These stolen bodies ended up in medical school amphitheaters, where wealthy students would learn surgery by cutting up the poor. The irony was perfect and perverse. The same people who couldn't afford medical care in life became teaching tools for doctors who would never treat their social class. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, coincidentally, also the mill owner from Hour 3, ran anatomy lessons at St. Bartholomew's Medical College. He'd perform public dissections like theatrical performances, charging admission to wealthy spectators who wanted to see death up close without the inconvenience of poverty. The workhouse wasn't just where the poor went to live, it was where they went to die. Mortality rates inside workhouses were double those of the general population, and that wasn't an accident. The system was designed to make poverty fatal. When inmates died, their bodies were 1. Stripped of any remaining possessions. 2. Examined for valuable organs, sold to medical schools. 3. Buried in unmarked workhouse graves. 4. Recorded in ledgers by number, not name. Behind every workhouse was a small graveyard filled with tiny graves. No names, just numbers. The Whitechapel Workhouse buried 847 children between 1840 and 1850, an average of one child every 4 days. These weren't deaths from epidemics or accidents. They were deaths from deliberate neglect, malnutrition, untreated illness, exposure, and despair. The workhouse was a child-killing machine operating under the pretense of charity. I can hear them now, 847 small voices calling out their real names instead of their assigned numbers, trying to remind the world that they existed, that they mattered, that they were more than statistical casualties. Even when families scraped together money for proper burials, they often got cheated. Funeral directors would reuse coffins, removing bodies after the service and burying them in cheap boxes, sell burial plots that were actually temporary storage, charge for services they never provided, use the cheapest materials while charging for premium options. The grief-stricken and illiterate poor had no recourse when they discovered the deception weeks later. Victorian society demanded elaborate mourning rituals, but only if you could afford them. Black mourning clothes, expensive and impractical for working families. Professional mourners, hired weepers for funerals. A mourning jewelry made from the deceased's hair. Extended periods of social withdrawal, impossible for families who needed to work. Poor families who couldn't afford proper mourning were judged as not loving their dead enough. Another way society blamed poverty on moral failing. If I had to count the spirits that haunt the poverty graveyards of London, the number would be staggering. 50,000 plus bodies in paupers' pits. 15,000 plus children who died in workhouses. 8,000 plus bodies stolen by resurrection men. A countless more who died unnamed and uncounted. They're all here with me now, filling my study with the weight of unmourned deaths. They're not angry. Anger requires energy they don't have. They're just tired. Tired of being forgotten. Tired of being reduced to statistics. Tired of haunting a world that never cared about them in the first place. Today we have a medical debt that follows families beyond death. A funeral costs that force families into bankruptcy. A cremation becoming the affordable option for the poor. Digital memorial services replacing physical graveyards. The technology changes, but the fundamental cruelty remains. Even death is a luxury good. As I write this final section of Hour 7, The voices are becoming overwhelming. Every unmarked grave, every stolen corpse, every child who died from deliberate neglect is trying to tell their story. They want to be remembered not as statistics but as individuals who deserved better. The graveyard of broken dreams isn't a place. It's a state of being. It's where hopes go to die when society decides that some lives matter less than others. And once you enter this graveyard, you never really leave. You just become another ghost, whispering warnings that nobody wants to hear. You know what the cruelest joke is? I've been dead this whole time. I thought I was researching poverty in the 1800s, safely removed by centuries of progress and social reform. But as I've been telling you these stories, I've started to realize the truth. I'm one of them. I've always been one of them. The shadows in my study aren't shadows anymore, they're people. Mrs. Whitmore is mending clothes that will never be clean. Little Tommy is still waiting outside the bakery for bread that will never come. The Hartwell children are reaching for books they'll never be allowed to read. And they're looking at me with recognition. Not surprise, recognition. Like they've been waiting for me to figure it out. See, poverty didn't end in the 1800s. It just got better at hiding. Those same systems, those same traps, those same soul-crushing mathematics, they're all still here. They just wear different clothes now. The bread that costs more when you're broke? Now it's buying in bulk at Costco. Save money if you have money to spend. The rent that traps you? Now it's credit scores, security deposits, and application fees. The machines that eat children? Now they're student loans and unpaid internships. The medicine that kills while it cures? Now it's medical bankruptcy and rationing insulin. The education that's only for the wealthy? Now it's private schools and college debt. The debt collectors who never stop? Now they have computers and algorithms. The graveyards of the poor? Now they're called homeless camps and shelter systems. I'm not a historian studying the past. I'm a ghost trying to warn the living. Because the wheel of poverty keeps turning, grinding up new generations with the same merciless efficiency it's always had. A minimum wage worker today pays 70% of their income for rent in major cities. A medical emergency can bankrupt a middle-class family overnight. Student debt follows you beyond death. The names change, the technology evolves, but the mathematics of desperation remain exactly the same. All these stories I've been telling you, I didn't research them in dusty archives. I lived them. I'm living them. Every night, I become William Hartwell in the factory, breathing phosphorus until my jaw rots. Every morning, I'm Mrs. Whitmore counting coins that will never be enough. Every afternoon, I'm little Mary reaching for books I'll never afford. The horror of poverty isn't just what it does to individuals, it's how it compounds across time. Every child who doesn't get educated becomes a parent who can't help their children learn. Every medical bill that isn't paid becomes a credit score that haunts housing applications. Every opportunity missed becomes a generational curse. The ghosts aren't separate people. They're all aspects of the same eternal victim, the person caught in poverty's web across every generation. The most terrifying realization? This isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature. Poverty isn't an unfortunate side effect of progress. It's the engine that powers wealth concentration. The rich need the poor to stay poor, or the whole machine stops working. Every story I've told you follows the same pattern. 1. Create artificial scarcity. 2. Charge premium prices for necessities. 3. Trap people in cycles they can't escape. 4. Blame individuals for systematic failures. 5. Profit from the suffering. 6. Repeat forever. Remember at the beginning when I asked you to comment about what you'd do if you found yourself in 1800s poverty. Here's the truth. You already have found yourself there. The costumes are different, the technology is fancier, but the game is exactly the same. So what are you going to do about it? As I finish this story, my study is filled with every person who ever died from poverty. Not just in the 1800s, but across all of human history. They're standing behind me, their hands on my shoulders, helping me type these words. They're not angry. Anger is for the living. They're determined. They want their stories told not for revenge, but for recognition. They want the living to understand. This doesn't have to be inevitable. Every time someone shares a story about medical bankruptcy, they're channeling Sarah Whitmore. Every time someone talks about student debt, they're speaking for Thomas Hartwell. Every time someone mentions working 2 jobs and still not making rent, they're giving voice to William Ashworth's tenants. Every time someone dies because they couldn't afford health care, they join the ghost army. The wheel is still turning. The machine is still hungry. The collectors are still coming. But here's what the ghosts want you to know. You're not powerless. Every system humans created can be changed by humans. Every law that protects wealth over people can be rewritten. Every trap that catches the poor can be dismantled. The dead can't vote, can't protest, can't organize. But you can. I'm not ending the story because the story never ends. Somewhere right now, someone is choosing between medicine and food. Someone is losing their home because they got sick. Someone is watching their children go without because poverty makes everything cost more. The ghosts of the 1800s don't rest because their nightmare is still happening. They'll keep haunting us until we wake up and change the system that killed them. So here's your final tally, the true cost of being poor across all of human history. Potential never realized, infinity. Dreams deferred to death, infinity. Lives cut short by systematic neglect, infinity. Families destroyed by artificial scarcity, infinity. Generations trapped in cycles of desperation, infinity. The bill is infinite, and it's still growing. Remember our names. Remember our stories. Remember that we were people, not statistics. Remember that this doesn't have to happen to others. And remember, every time you say, "That's just the way things are," you're choosing to keep us trapped here in this eternal haunting. The price of being poor is everything. Your health, your dreams, your children's futures, your very soul. But the price of ignoring poverty, that's everything too. If you like this journey into the abyss, hit that like button. The ghosts appreciate being heard. Subscribe for more nightmares disguised as history. And comment below. Now that you know the truth about poverty's price, what are you going to do about it? Because unlike us, you still have time to change the ending. The end? Or is it? You came back. Of course you did. The ghosts told me you would. Your comments became a digital Ouija board. Every response, every story you shared about your own struggles with poverty, medical debt, student loans, choosing between gas money and groceries, they all fed into the collective haunting. User at @BrokeButNotBroken wrote, "My grandmother rationed her insulin and died because she couldn't afford it. This could be 1840 or 2024. Same story, different century. User at Factory Worker's Daughter shared, "My great-great-grandfather lost 3 fingers in a textile mill. My daughter just graduated with $80,000 in debt for a degree that got her a job that barely covers rent. The machines just wear different faces now." User at Single Mom Surviving confessed, "I've pawned my wedding ring 6 times this year. Every time I get it back, I know I'll have to pawn it again. The cycle never ends." Your stories revealed them, the contemporary body snatchers who profit from desperation, payday lenders who harvest financial corpses, medical debt collectors who raid the sick, landlords who feed on housing scarcity, for-profit colleges that sell debt disguised as dreams. They're still here, still working, still turning human suffering into profit margins. The story went viral across 47 countries. People shared their own poverty horror stories. From Mumbai, "Children still work in factories here. Same machines, same broken bones, same phantom limbs reaching for education they'll never get." From Sao Paulo, "Favela families pay more for water than rich neighborhoods. The poor tax is universal. It speaks every language." From Detroit, "Medical bankruptcies are the new debtors' prisons. Same chains, different paperwork." Even the platforms that hosted this content proved the point. YouTube's algorithm pushed ads for payday loan companies during the debt collection segments, for-profit colleges during the education section, rent-to-own furniture during the housing horror, miracle medical treatments during the healthcare nightmare. The machine was literally feeding on the story of its own cruelty. The generational recognition. The most haunting responses came from families discovering their own ghosts, records showing their ancestor died in the same workhouse I described. 3 generations later, their family was still struggling with poverty. Their family's financial trauma traced back to 6 generations. Every ancestor trapped by the same systematic exclusions, the same impossible mathematics. A man was the first in their family to graduate college, but the student debt meant their children might not escape the cycle either. But here's what really chills me. The view count keeps growing even when nobody's watching. The analytics show viewers who don't exist, comments from accounts that were never created, engagement from IP addresses that lead nowhere. The dead are watching too. They're finally seeing their stories told, their names remembered, their warnings heard. The living are finally fighting back against the machine that creates ghosts. The conspiracy isn't hidden. It's just so vast and normalized that we stopped seeing it as conspiracy. This story doesn't end because the system it exposes is still operating. Every day, new ghosts join the ranks. Someone dies rationing medicine they can't afford. A family becomes homeless despite working full-time. A student sells their future to buy an education. A parent chooses between their own health and their children's needs. But now you know. Now you see. Now you're haunted too. The ghosts have a message for everyone still breathing. Don't just watch our story, change the ending. Don't just remember our names. Prevent new ones from joining us. Don't just feel haunted. Haunt the system back. Every view is a vigil. Every share is a seance. Every comment is a conversation with the dead. The real horror, the most terrifying thing isn't that poverty was a nightmare in the Dark Age or 1800s. It's that we've had 180+ years to fix it, and we chose not to. We've had the technology, the resources, the knowledge, and the moral imperative. But we've also had a system that profits from scarcity, and that system has more power than human compassion. Until now, you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unhear these voices. You can't unknow that every economic law that creates poverty was written by humans and can be rewritten by humans. You're haunted now. The question is, what are you going to do with that haunting? If you want to stay connected to this ongoing investigation into the systems that create ghosts, subscribe to the channel. But more importantly, subscribe to the idea that human suffering isn't inevitable, it's manufactured. Like this video if you're ready to be haunted by the truth. Comment below with your own ghost stories. The poverty that haunts your family, your community, your world. Share this everywhere because the dead can't speak for themselves. The never-ending story. We are the ghosts of poverty past, present, and future. We are the phantom children, the evicted families, the medically bankrupted, the educationally denied, the generationally trapped. We are every person who died because someone else's profit mattered more than our lives. We are the warning you can no longer ignore. We are the haunting that won't end until the killing stops. Remember us. Remember our names. Remember our stories. And remember, you still have time to change the ending. In memory of every person who died because poverty was more profitable than compassion. This video is dedicated to the living who still have time to choose differently. Next video. The price of being rich, how wealth kills souls coming never, because the wealthy don't like their ghosts documented.